The Bookshelf with Ryan Tubridy is brought to you by Eason, Ireland's favourite bookseller. Eason have a rich heritage of bookselling since 1886, and it's probably where you got your first ever book, or maybe your last one, and indeed, hopefully, your next one after you listen to this episode of our podcast. And stay listening for our Ryan Recommends slot, my weekly recommendation, where I'll discuss a book I've read recently that I think you'll really enjoy too. As ever, all the books we discuss on this episode of our podcast are available now in your local Eason store, or order online from easons.com before 6 p.m. for same-day dispatch with free delivery when you spend over a tenner. Eason, be inspired. Today on the Bookshelf, we're joined by one of the most inspiring and influential advocates for disability rights. She is Joanne O'Riordan. Joanne is somebody, if I could deviate from the regular introduction for a moment, to say to you that she has somebody I've met many years ago and I've interviewed a lot of times. And I always say, when people say, who are your favourite guests, I always cite her as one of mine for reasons that will become apparent, I think, for most of you listening over the next little while, because she is an extraordinary person and known for her advocacy and empowering perspective. She has made waves as a journalist. She's also a brilliant public speaker, and might I add, a fine and funny private speaker, and champion for inclusivity and accessibility. So today we're going to be diving into the reader behind the headlines. We're going to talk to Joanne about three of her favourite books from her own bookshelf: her childhood book, the book that made her cry, and of course the book that changed her life. Joanne O'Riordan, it's so lovely to see you again. How are you?
Thanks so much for having me. That intro, I need to bring my A game here now, just in case.
Yeah. Do you remember the first time we met? I can't recall right now. I think it was probably the Late Late Show, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was 2011. I just effectively doorstepped into Kenny, then Taoiseach. I had met him after my junior cert mock, and he swore he was going to protect people with disabilities in his budget, and then they made a cut to effectively the payment made to parents for kind of teenagers, 16 to 18-year-olds with disabilities.
Yeah.
And I wrote a letter to the Examiner because I had bumped into some journalists at that stage, just generally, you know, like just people you would have known around the block. And one of them got in touch with me, and then I was on a school trip to Dublin for TY, and your good producers called, and we panicked that day, and we just ran to New Look and got the quickest thing we could find, and I went on your show the day after.
You don't strike me as somebody who would have been nervous about being on a talk show or a chat show. Were you nervous about the Late Late appearance, or did you just rock and roll on?
No, I mean, I've been watching you in the Late Late for quite some time, and I suppose I knew what I was kind of getting into, and you know, I knew I was 15 at the time, so I knew you weren't going to be like telling me about the ways of the world, hopefully. But we had met generally when I was doing a dry run at the ramp, and the two of us had a great time. And I think, I mean, you know this yourself, and I know this from, you know, pastly interviewing people as well. It's up to you to make them comfortable, you know. And I think you know, not to toot your horn, but you did a stellar job of making the whole situation just a breeze, I think, for everyone involved, you know, parents and siblings and family included. So, you know, because as you know, it's not just you who goes on stage. There's an army of people behind you wishing you well, you know, and they're more anxious probably than you are because they can't control you.
yeah, for sure. I'm tempted to, especially for our listeners from maybe who aren't from Ireland, to kind of go back to the beginning with you, Joanne, and tell us a bit about when you were born and how you might have been, you know, to your folks' reaction when they saw you first and said, okay, well, this isn't like the other kids we had. Why don't we cut to the chase in that regard and tell us a bit about yourself in the physical aspect of coming into the world, so that then people can get a handle on where we're going to go in our books chat. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, no worries. So I guess I have 4 older siblings, 3 brothers and a sister, and I'm the youngest by 8 years. So there's a big gap between us, and the gap between me and the eldest is 15 years. Me and my brother did it. So I guess when I was born, my parents didn't know until 9 weeks before I was born the way that I was going to be born that I am today. So I have a very rare condition known as total Amelia. So Amelia is Latin for limbs, so obviously total means none. So I was born basically missing all of my limbs. And I guess, you know, when I was born, the doctors who were kind of looking in were, you know, like, you know, what is the point of this? And, you know, like, well, she's never going to do anything, because this was 1996, so disability wouldn't have been a thing at the time, where, you know, I guess we're aware of it now, but we're still not maybe, kind of helpful with it. But at that time, there was nothing whatsoever. So my parents were kind of just left to kind of fend for themselves, basically, with four other children as well, who were teenagers. So they all had lives that were bigger than my existence. So yeah, it was funny. The doctors would have encouraged my parents not to really take me out, purely out of like shame and, like you've got four other healthy kids. Why would you entertain this one kind of job? But when I was brought home to my siblings, they didn't care in the slightest. They were like, this is class. My eldest brother, Dennis, said, if anyone bullies her, I'll beat them up. So that was very helpful. And then the more, I guess, they saw me grow into my personality, the more they realized it was me who would be doing the beating up on their behalf. I needed to. So yeah, literally, we were only saying this the other day, when I was about 2 weeks old, my parents had to go to a football match. One of my brothers was playing and they brought me with them. And you know yourself, when you have any baby, the first thing you say is, oh, do you want to hold the baby? And my parents were asking her, do you want to hold her? Because we're kind of sick of holding her. Yeah, that's what life was like. No one really cared that I was different. When I was younger, so I was about maybe 1 or 2, there was an offer of prosthetics, but they weren't functional prosthetics, so they were purely aesthetic. So all they were just like hands and legs that did nothing. So my parents had kind of said, grand, we'll get them just to see would she like them or whatever. And they came home and I had the prosthetics on. I had arms, and my second eldest brother, Denny, said, she looks like a doll. She looks stupid. Take them off. We like her the way she is. And 2 minutes later, he threw me into a Christmas tree, wrestling me. So that just showed they had no care in the world.
Wow. I've a few pickups on what you've been saying there, and questions wise. So I want to, first of all, the reaction from the medics around you to your parents going, the words you used were really quite shocking. Where what if we go? What would you be doing with this? As if to say this creature. I mean, it is stunning language. I mean, language is so important in our conversation and in your life, as you well know. What are we going to do this? Or why would you even take her out to the football or to the shops or whatever? I mean, this is like something out of medieval times, let alone the late 1990s. Talk to me about that. And also your parents who must have been thinking, what? I mean, were they shocked by the language they were hearing? Were they going, well, the doctor knows best in that paternalistic sense? So talk to me a bit about that.
Yeah, I guess one doctor in particular told my mother that effectively, when you're a child and you get a doll and the doll starts losing limbs, like, the arms and legs start falling off because it's an old doll, he asked my mother, what do you do with the doll? And my mother was like, I don't know. Like, you keep the doll, I guess. And he was like, no, would you not put broken dolls into the attic? My mother was like, no, not particularly. And they were like, oh, and what they were hinting at was, there's kind of plenty of homes, for kids with disabilities where you put them and don't really see them ever again. That's what they were kind of marginally hinting at. So obviously they were, I can't speak for them obviously personally, but obviously if that was me, I would have been very angry, I suppose, more than anything at the time. So I guess really there was, that sort of steely determination on their end, where they were like, okay, that's not going to happen here. We've got other children we need to think about. So you can't exactly wallow in time either, because they're also going, I need to go to football, or I need to go dancing, or I need to do score, or I need to do whatever. So they had that to think about. And then I suppose they just came home, and I suppose with the support of like aunts, uncles, their relatives, cousins who would have been born around the same time as I am. So we have 3 cousins, the 3 of us are best friends, and we're all born within 6 months of each other. And I suppose my parents were like, she's going to be the exact same as the 2 lads who were born, obviously with their limbs. And that's exactly how it was. I wasn't treated any different from anyone else. And I guess really at that time, again, it just like disability at the time was a problem for people to fix, not for society to fix around you, if that makes sense. So that was very much the air of it. And I suppose my parents would have been a little bit ahead of the curve, and they were like, things might have to be done differently, but she can still do the things. It just might take her 5 minutes longer or whatever. And so be it. And I think to describe it as, put a broken doll into the attic was just a language of its time, and just the whole identification of disability, which was, it's a medical problem. What do you do with medical issues? You fix them. This one you can't fix because she'll never obviously be able to grow limbs. I'm not a werewolf. So that was kind of the idea. If she can't be, if it's broken, why are you bothering to fix it? And my parents were like, but nothing's broken. We're going to fix everything around her, so she's not broken, if that makes sense.
Would you like to be a werewolf?
Ideally, yeah. In an ideal world, yeah. I'd love to full moon, regrow some limbs, be grand.
I'm glad you weren't born in Dublin in 1973 around May, because then you would have been probably sitting beside me in school and we would have got nothing done, because you're a yapper. Where did the yapping come from? You're brilliant. I mean, we would not stop talking. So talk to me about that. I was going to say confidence. It's not confidence. You're just curious and you love to talk.
Yeah, I think it's just an intrigue in like what people have to say, or like thoughts or opinions or whatever. I think that's, what it is. And I enjoy kind of bringing conversations out of people. And I suppose I find that everyone has a story, no matter who it is. And it doesn't matter, if you're like a security guard for whoever, if you're just the doorman, to me, there's no one who's like lesser than, if that makes sense. And I suppose that maybe might have came because people thought I was lesser than like the general public, whereas that wasn't the behavior when I was at home. So I suppose I don't treat people like that either. I guess the confidence, I don't know. I think it's a learned thing. I think people learn it and grow into it over time. But I think, what people kind of, like some of my close friends would say, for all of my confidence, there's also, I guess, I wouldn't say like an insecurity, but like a mild kind of like, hesitance, to kind of go out. I was saying it to a friend of mine yesterday. We were invited to a Christmas party and I said, I mightn't go to the Christmas party because I don't know many people there. And I said to her, I'm kind of a clinger, on a night out. I like talking to people, but I like having someone I can go home with after, someone that knows me. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. Tell me about books for a moment. When you were young, you said Tetra-Amelia means no limbs. So you've no limbs. What you can't hold a book, is that correct? I mean, or tell me how that works. The practicality of a book.
Yeah, so I guess when I went to school, first of all, my parents made sure that I learned how to read and write the same as everyone else. So I can write. So I have my pen here, so I can pick up a pen and write like that. And then worst case scenario, I can hold the pen in between my cheek like this and write away like that. Obviously, then when our school library was introduced, and books were handed out to people, I couldn't hold the book. Especially like big books, like the kind of spines, that the book would kind of close back in on itself. And there was a book in our school library, and it was Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. And effectively what happened was the spine was broken in the book, so it was just kind of broken up. And the teacher said, Joanne can hold that one. I'll just give that to her. So that was my book that I had to read for the week and do an essay on. And that was basically then, I suppose, how I got introduced to reading was through that book. And I was quite young. I was asking my mom, and she said, you were really young when you read that book, because I remember she picked it up. And she doesn't read, she always says, when I used to write articles in the Irish Times, she'd read the first line and the last line and then tell me, I read your article, and then she'd describe it to me. And I'm like, you didn't read it though.
So let's go to the book from your childhood then, Joanne. You mentioned a book there. Is that the one you're going to go with?
Yeah, so the Roll of Thunder, Hear Me Cry was my first childhood book. So yeah, it's the one that always sticks out in my brain.
Tell us a bit about it. Can you remember the story or anything about it? Or is it just that you can remember the fact that the spine was broken and therefore you could read it on your own?
No, I guess the story, for kind of people who aren't, kind of familiar, I suppose it's kind of about like racial injustice, that would have existed in America way back when, schools being separated, whites versus people of color, that kind of era. And I suppose for me, what I kind of saw in it was something similar to my own family. I suppose there was injustice in terms of like people with disabilities and kind of, being an outsider, kind of being an outcast, which I obviously related to a little bit, from Cassie, and the gang. And I suppose I always remember Cassie's determination, more importantly, of trying to, right the wrongs, even though she was only a child herself. And I suppose that's kind of something that I remember quite vividly, and kind of it, I wouldn't say like affecting you in terms of like, it's like life changing. But I remember like being very young and kind of thinking, children shouldn't have to relate to this book that's about a lot of bad things. Do you know what I mean? Yet I think I could relate a little bit to the story that was kind of being told, and more importantly, I guess the family element, and how your family can kind of keep it all together for you. And kind of, if you've got the backbone and the support of your family, you can kind of face, I'm not saying you can kind of face anything, but there's a lot of things that kind of come your way that once you have a group around you, you can kind of overcome it. It might take a long time and it might be heartbreaking, it might be rough most of the time. But as long as you have that support group, I think it matters. And I think that's why I related to the book so much.
I was thinking as you were talking that of all the books to have a broken spine, how peculiarly important it was that was the one.
Yeah, and it was bizarre.
Yeah,
it was bizarre.
Because of the message, and it was talking to you as a young white girl in, Southern Ireland, for want of a better expression, in the position you were in the life that you were given, identifying, with a different type of, you used the word outcasting, type of thing. It's extraordinary because, it could have been the Deep Beano or the Dandy or the Guinness Book of Records that had a broken spine that day, and you could have become interested in cartoons or facts and figures or whatever. But no, it was this one. I mean, it feels like it kind of was thrown in front of you by fate almost, even if you don't believe in that kind of thing. It just seems to me, such an extraordinary moment.
Yeah, because like you said, like we all had to do, the end of week review on the book or whatever. And, like you said, my friends would have read, Beano, or they would have got a couple of comic books as well in between. So I don't know, was it like, the teacher was kind of mildly, trying to angle the book towards the individual, maybe? I don't know. I read recently Phil Jackson, the former Chicago Bulls coach, when he was coaching Michael Jordan and that super team in the early 90s, he actually interviewed the players first and he got them all a book individually, what he thought suited their characteristics. So it's funny, when I read that, I always wondered, was the teacher secretly doing that with us? Because why was it me who got the really deep book? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying there was like, more intelligent kids in my class, but there were, children who were still a bit more higher up in terms of, their class results and whatnot. But it was me who happened to get that book. And I think it was kind of funny. I think it was just for me, it was, I suppose, like the resilience and the stuff like that, in the book was what had kind of stood out to me. And you're reading kind of lines you don't really understand and you don't really know why any of that stuff is happening. But it kind of opens up your mind to kind of see that maybe like the world isn't all it's hyped up to be, because there's certain things that exist, that barriers and imaginary obstacles that you can kind of break down. And I just, now it's always a book that kind of stood out and always one that I'd reference, all the time. But there was definitely something about our schools and books about injustice, because we also had To Kill a Mockingbird. We had a load of other kind of random ones as well. So there was something about our school and trying to, but it's funny as well how like things impact on people. Obviously, I got that book, and then now that I'm a little bit older and my friends are going into jobs and, we're all moving on with our lives.
Tell me, when you were young and getting into the kind of teenage years, I think I might have said this to you before, we're going to say it again, that I think if I was in your position, no limbs, in a chair, going to school every day and then watching people skipping along or playing sports, whatever, I'd feel resentful and I would rage and I would ask, why did I get these weird lotto numbers that aren't suiting me at all? It all seems incredibly unfair. The why me point. Did that come into your life at any point? That sense of injustice to yourself, a sort of a personal sense of, good God, this doesn't seem fair, right, or kind. Or did that pass you by?
There were definitely times. I think things where you'd go to a football match maybe, and your friends were sitting up in the back of the stand having a jolly good time, but you can't get to the back of the stand because it's all steps. So you just sit in the front with, parents or whatever, that's fine. But when you're 14, that's not fine. So maybe in terms of that, maybe in terms of when we started going to teen discos maybe and stuff like that, a lot of them wouldn't have been accessible. They'd be in old GA halls or wherever poor Shaq could handle a load of teenagers storming in listening to, I don't know, Maroon 5. So maybe there was a bit of that when I was of that age. But it never turned really to anger. And I think I always had my friends to kind of back it up. So when we were, getting our junior cert results, for example, I remember my friends wouldn't go out unless the bus could carry the wheelchair. And then the bus couldn't carry the wheelchair at the time. So there was a bit of a panic inside. And then one of them said, sure, can't Joanne sit on the seat normally and someone just bring her wheelchair? So my parents were the one who had to bring my wheelchair. But to my friends in school, it didn't matter. I was there, someone sat next to me, we were all fairly minded and protective. But at the same time, it wasn't an overbearing protective. So I could also experience the world as well as they were experiencing it. So I think when you have the people around you who are like, it's totally fine, like everything's fine, you can see mild panic in their faces as well. When we were talking about when I was, I was at Paris, for the Paralympics, not to skip ahead. And I texted one of my friends from school. I said, remember when we were in Paris for our school trip? And he was like, the only memory I have of Paris was getting to the Arc de Triomphe and us saying, oh my God, we have to go into the roundabout. There's no pedestrian crossing. The only way to the Arc de Triomphe is under the roundabout and there's steps there. Like, Joanne's going to die. And then eventually a group of the like GA fellas, like the GA lads, came together and were like, we'll lift her. And they said to my parents, would you mind if we lifted the chair? And my mother was like, sure, I don't mind. If you don't hurt yourself, belt away. Like, no interest in my life, by the way. My mother was like, if you die, you die. It is what it is. One less to worry about, thank God. And four of them just got together and lifted the wheelchair, and we all got to the Arc of Triomphe safely.
Yeah, you got good friends, haven't you?
It's weird. I think, you don't really realize, the impact. I think they're the same. I don't think none of us realize the impact we all had in each other's lives.
Yeah.
Up until you have to experience all the different things maybe in life along the way. Do you know what I mean? So
yeah,
it's funny. Like,
I'm quick to add, because I felt as soon as I said that was wrong. You've got good friends. You're all good friends. That's a different way of putting it, because you obviously are great friends to them, because otherwise they wouldn't hang out with you. And they're good friends to you, and they seem like they're kind of blind to any of the wheelchair, the so-called disability, whatever you want to call it. They just want Joanne. The rest is just by the by.
Yeah, I think the thing is, like, they're blind to me, but not blind to life. Do you know what I mean? So they're blind. They're more like, okay, she has no limbs, that's fine. It's a bit terrible she can't go into a nightclub. That's not her fault, that's the club's fault. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Whereas other people could swing that on their head and be like, well, we're not hanging out with her because we really want to go to that nightclub. And she can't go. Do you know what I mean? Like, she's the one who can't get in, so just leave her. Whereas they'd never do that. Do you know what I mean?
You kept reading, I take it. You became a reader, because I know you love journalism, and we've talked about your curiosity, Joanne. But what sort of books did you start getting into, or did you, as you head into your teens, late teens and thereabouts, or were there particular authors or genre that you liked, or what was happening there?
Yeah, my eldest brother Dennis would have had a trolley of books. So there was a lot of history books in his time. So there was a lot of history of Ireland, history, a lot of Michael Collins. I don't know, I should not be concerned about him, but there was a lot of Michael Collins. And when he left for Sweden in 2008, he immigrated, and he just left his pile of books for me. So that was quite nice of him. And there was a lot of kind of stuff in there. And he used to do delivery driving in Cork. So, whenever they were kind of swapping out the shelves and putting in new books and kind of throwing out the other ones, he'd rescue them and be like, I have people for them. Like, it's fine. He'd read them anyway. But so yeah, we had a lot of Jacqueline Wilson when I was a teenager. Mm-hmm. Well, young teenager. We had a lot of those ones. We had it was funny, because then I probably would have stopped reading in secondary school, because reading kind of wasn't cool. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it was kind of at that time where you were either into sport and you don't read, or you're into books and you're not into sport. So it was an odd kind of thing to go down the middle. And I think because I couldn't play, so I didn't have training Tuesday, Thursdays, and a game on Sunday, I had probably that extra time to fill. So I probably just kept reading whatever was kind of coming my way. So it was like English books, that we had to do. I would have read those. I was one of the few people in my class. My school friends used to mock me all the time. I actually enjoyed Shakespeare and poetry. Like, I actually didn't mind them. I actually always thought they were quite fun. They would be like, oh my God, that's so embarrassing, Joanne. But it's funny, they know when I'm having a down day, because I read a lot of poetry, like, like Patrick Kavanagh and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So they'd always be like, oh, Joanne's depressed, she's sending us Patrick Kavanagh. Like, what happened to you, Joanne? I'd be like, the dog.
I did Patrick Kavanagh for the Leaving Cert as well back in the 1890s, and it's always Advent, we have tested and tasted too much lover through chink too wide comes in no wonder. You remember the lines we had to learn, and they stay with you. But something about Kavanagh, so earthy, oh stony grey soil of Monaghan, the love for my life, all these. He's my favourite as well. I mean, what was he saying? Or does he say to you? Why do you like Patrick Kavanagh, Monaghan's greatest son?
Do you know, I think it's funny, as you said. I think it was like the lyricism in his poetry. Do you know what I mean? Like, there was constantly like a beat kind of going through it. Like there was a rhythm and a rhyme. Not necessarily like a rhyme in terms of like time, crime, whatever. Yeah. It was just, there was something about it that was quite, like fluid, and it moved quite well. And I just remember he was the last poet we learned for our junior cert. So we did Heaney, Dickinson, Plath. We did all those first. And Kavanagh was last. And I kind of was like, why is he last? He was actually the most intriguing out of all of them. And I said to a school friend, they were like, you need to get a life, Joanne. Like, you can't be stuck inside reading Kavanagh. And I was like, I don't know. Brendan Kennelly's another one. He's, The Beginning. That's one of my favorite poems of all time. That's one I love. Yeah. And whenever I'm having not a bad day, but a sad day in particular. But I think, to kind of rewind a little bit, my dad's cousin was actually a writer for the Corkman and the Kerryman down here.
The newspapers.
So he did a lot of poetry. He did a lot of poetry and a lot of play writing.
Okay.
He loved writing plays, and my dad was always like, "Oh, I thought that gene was dead because it skipped me, but it didn't. So now you have it."
I love that. And, talking about poetry to kind of get you through, if you like, an emotional speed bump in a given day, let's go to the book that made you cry. And we'll talk about crying first. To cry or not to cry, that is the question.
I don't cry
No
unless
crying.
it's an animal. I don't. Yeah, I get dog abuse for it, for my inability to cry. We were watching The Crown, me and a group of friends, and they were showing Queen Elizabeth and her little kind of fake tear. And one of the lads was like, "That's you."
The crocodile tear.
And it's like that, oh, I know I have to cry because it's really sad, but I just can't seem to well up. So, because they were laughing, because probably the last time I cried, let's put it like that, was when she died and they passed her horse and her dog. And I was like, this is the saddest thing to ever happen. And they were like, really, Joanne? Really?
Yeah.
Like, she's like, they're fine. And I'm like, but dogs know. Like, dogs know. And they were like, you need to get a life, Joanne.
Let's talk about the book that made you cry then. Obviously, as we established, it must be a book about animals of some of the animal farm. I don't know what it might be, but as you're now a self-confessed psychopath / sociopath who can't or doesn't cry, and if they do, has to force a fake one, where are we going here with this?
I'm laughing. Animal farm reminds me of sociology studies.
Yes.
Why is this animal greater than the other? That's why I got a flashback. I got a flashback there to essays in college.
Triggered.
Big time. The book that I chose, I suppose, that made me cry is Rob Delaney, big time actor. In Channel 4 and in the States as well. And his book is about his son Henry, and it's called A Heart That Works. And I suppose the book is kind of one of those things where he goes through the story of his child, but with like a tenderness and a humor of Henry getting sick with a rare illness. But there's a kind of thing, I suppose, that we relate as a family as well, which is there was a humor he used to mask the sadness, but also to hammer the point home of how how terrible it is to have someone who's sick in your life, especially a child who's kind of so young. And I think the thing about the book was that you were like laughing, crying, so you were like, but it was like the thing where you felt kind of like, it's an odd cry because it's like a relieving cry, because you're like, oh man, this is so sad, but also the way he's describing it is so interesting. And I'm not for one moment imagining what him and the family went through. The book does a good enough job. It's just, I wouldn't say a small enough book, but it's more than 100 pages, so small enough in terms of you're a big time reader. And I think the big thing was it was probably very difficult to write, and like working in media, you and I probably would know how many people you have to go through to get your story told, like retelling your story 600 times. So I couldn't imagine the pain of having to relive it every single time. But I think the book will always stand in your mind in terms of the resilience, character, loving family story that came out of such a sad time.
Yeah, I haven't read that book, but it does sound very, very moving. And I think that I do know that in any time one encounters darkness in one's life, I often find humor is a wonderful way out of that. And I don't know if that's the same for you.
Big time. I mean, we're big on mocking each other here at home, to the point where people kind of gasp when they come into the house. They're like, oh my God, like, was that actually said? And I suppose we forget that other people wouldn't be like adjusted to it or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny. I remember being in Sweden visiting my brother. Me and my sister, my parents went over, and so the wheelchair gets taken for the flight. It goes into hold where the luggage goes. So it depends really on the airport, but sometimes they'll take it at the plane or they'll take it at check-in. You get a little push wheelchair to get you around the airport. And my parents were pushing me, and some fella came over and he kind of asked, like, what was the story? And my sister was like, oh, she stepped on a landmine. It's, it's not great. I was like, Jesus, Gillian, like, let it, let people live, so yeah, and it that happens, like all the time. Literally a couple of nights ago, me and my mother, we were getting a season ticket for Cork GA for me and my dad, and we got into an argument because the carer goes free, and I said, I think it's the wheelchair who goes free, and I'm paying for the carer because they have the seat, because I have a seat. And my mother was like, well, you're taking up the most room. And I was like, Jesus, Anne, God forbid the girl with no limbs wants to get out and live her life. Jesus, woman. So we were laughing at that for about maybe 5 minutes. And going back to dogs, we had a dog and he was 15 when he died, but he was deaf, mute and blind. And it got to a stage where I was saying, I could draw the carers allowance now for him. Like, Jesus, he's so bad. I could draw the carers allowance. And my dad, I mean, he'll kill me for saying it. My dad is nearly 70. He'll be 70 in January. And he's going for a knee operation. And he doesn't get any sympathy here. So he'd be like, my knees are sore. And I'm like, Dad, you have knees. I don't have knees. And he'd be like, just let me live in my knee pain and peace, please, for the love of God. We mock him all the time. And then I said to my mom when I was getting the ticket, I said, I'm getting a wheelchair and a carer. And my mother was like, you should probably get 2 wheelchairs now because your father will be in crutches now for quite some time. So you might need to get 2 disabled tickets. I was like, mother, please. So,
I love that.
Yeah, I think humor is a big thing,
And I know
it's
that
full of love.
it is. No, I get that, and it is full of love. And I just love everything you've just said. There is winning for me. I just love that dark humor. What else? I mean, I don't think I'll ever get the image of you stepping on a landmine out of my head now for the rest of the day. But
no one does after that story. No one does.
It's a crack. Tell me about the dating game. How's that?
I'm very traditional, just to clarify. So I'm very traditional.
What does that mean?
I like, kind of non-apps. I'm not app-based. I like, human one-to-one kind of meetings, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. That would be kind of it for me. Dating is fun and not fun. I have 3 older brothers, so I'm very hardened in terms of, how people behave and whatnot. I've seen all sides of that coin from having older siblings, so I know what to expect. It's funny, like, I think, I'm very, how would you kind of describe it? I'm not very traditional in terms of, I wouldn't run away to get married. I used to have a PA, an assistant, and the two of us agreed that a piece of paper, doesn't define love. I'm now working in law, but I love tax credits as well. So that's, one side of the coin. How romantic, to say the least. And I think I'm very independent in that I don't like people hanging off other people. So I would have friends who are dating people and, they'd be like, oh, I have to meet up with him now tonight. And I'm like, why do you have to meet up with him though? And they're like, because we haven't seen each other in like 5 hours. And I'm like, I couldn't live a life like that. So people probably would say my big downfall is not having no limbs. It's the fact I have no interest in the person that I date.
which is, I was going to say arguably, but forget about the qualification, which is much more important.
I would say it's probably top 10. I don't know if you watch Martha Stewart's documentary on Netflix.
Started it last night.
Yeah, I don't know if you got to the scene where they asked her about partners and she's like, I'm not into talking to my partner. And I was like, Jesus, Martha, strong relate there.
Do you have dreams in that regard about marriage, family, kids, all that sort of? Is that too personal a question?
No, not at all. Kids, no, I've never been. I'm not saying maternal, in traditional context. I have nieces and nephews. They would say I'm good crack. But they also know that I can only handle them for a couple of hours until I'm like, please leave now. I want my peace and quiet. So they laugh at it that way. I probably would have been the least child oriented. It's funny, actually, my mother isn't very child oriented. And I think that's why she, like, in the slightest, she is very awkward. She had to answer her first trick-or-treater a couple of weeks ago, and they were dressed as baby sharks. So they did the song for her, and she didn't know what was going on. And one of them said, oh, I escaped from the aquarium. And she goes, but that's okay. Because she just didn't know what to say to the child. And I was like, outside, I was like, what did she say to these poor children? I would say, like, I have the energy for a lot of children for a couple of hours and then I kind of tire out,
Yeah.
But I like interacting with children every once in a while. You know what I mean? Like, I do get great fun out of it. I do a couple of primary school talks, and there's no way to humble you like a primary school talk. And I think, it wouldn't be on the cards for me. And I think, there's a lot of, not to get too into it, but I suppose there's a lot of legal hurdles in this country as well, in terms of not carrying your own child and using a surrogate and different things. There's a lot of hurdles at the moment. And, I praise any couple that come out and, speak. I know Mark from Westlife and Brian and Arthur Dowling, they speak as well quite positively about trying to change the laws. And, fair play to them, because it's tiring having a child, but also having to fight for your right as well. And if that changes, it might change my mind. But at the moment, it's probably a no for me. In terms of marriage, the tax credit would be nice, but I've done a law case where, you you can also get the widow's pension when you're long-term couple, so that'd be quite nice as well.
And sociopath just becomes a psychopath. This is great. What is the name of the book that changed your life?
Just after all that, yeah, she's a nut job. But anyway,
I just wonder, are they related? That's why I'm going there straight away.
No, we're going on a really dark turn, though. I suppose for me, I've mentioned a couple of times, I'm now, after changing careers, I'm now training to be a solicitor. And I remember when I was in college reading, because I used to love reading articles and stuff like that in college, reading The Guardian, Irish Times, Examiner, whatever it may be. And I think it was The Guardian, I remember I read an article about her name was Emily Doe, because the victims were anonymous at the time. And Emily Doe was at a party with her sister, and she had a little bit too much to drink and she passed out. And she unfortunately got, trigger warning, I guess, sexually assaulted and raped. And I was following the case as it went bit by bit, because the defendant's name was released, and he was a guy by the name of Brock Turner, who could have been a swimmer for Team USA.
Yeah, I remember this.
And basically the case ended on them not sending him to jail to not ruin his life, which I thought was a bit weird at the time. And even working in the law, you're like, it's a bit strange. But look, every solicitor has to do what they got to do. And so Emily Doe eventually released her name to the public. She's Chanel Miller, and she wrote a book called Know My Name. And I thought what was really bizarre about the article was that she actually wanted to be a children's author, but she felt after that night it was taken away from her because no parent would pick up a book written by a girl who was found half naked behind a bin. That line always kind of stands out because it's a tag and a label that's been hurled at her against her will, kind of similar to me in a very different context. She's disabled, she can't do anything. And yet it's trying to overcome that stereotype and the label and the mental resolve to overcome such a horrific experience, I think.
That is, I think there's a fascinating thread between the three books you've chosen. From the childhood, there was that sense of, desegregation or what have you, segregation in African Americans. Then this book that you mentioned is about, as you say, labels and dignity and resilience. And even the Rob Delaney book is about accepting and fighting again. Your story is about fighting. You've got this. One of the reasons I love you so much is because you have such a sunny disposition, but there's fire always. There's a flash of steel always. No suffering of fools. No tolerating mediocrity when it comes to what you need, deserve, and are owed, or whatever you want to call it. So tell me a little bit about where that comes from, or am I making sense? Is this help? Does this describe you? Am I right, or have I got completely off the mark here?
No, I think you're right, and I think if you want to talk about the thread between these three books, I think the common thread between, let's say, all four of us and people in general who go through hard times is that, my father will disagree, makes he works in steel. Steel bends after a while if you put it under so much pressure, and the fire can go out. And it's actually about what happens when the fire goes out and the steel bends that helps you get back to somewhat normal, which is not a popular topic, as in it's not the sexy, glamorous story that people want to read about to a certain degree. People want to read about the highs, how I got to the highs all the time.
Yes.
And one of my favorite journalists is Jimmy Breslin. And he did that really incredible story on John F. Kennedy's Gravedigger. And the reason why he did it was because he used his sporting knowledge in that he believes that the winning dressing room might have a good story, but the losing dressing room will always have a better story because it's a bigger story in terms of resilience and comeback.
Yeah, give us a snapshot of that Jimmy Breslin story for people.
Yeah, basically Jimmy Breslin, all the press were kind of congregating at the, the funeral corsage and, what Jackie O was wearing and, what was going on, who was crying, who was not crying. And Jimmy Breslin kind of said, I'm not going to go to the scrum. I'm going to try and go somewhere else and see if I can pick up something. So he went into the grave way before the funeral and he walked around and he said, what's your job for today? And, I'm doing this. Okay, grand. What's your job for the day? And the fella said, I'm digging a grave. And he said, do you know what grave you're digging by any chance? And the fella said, no. He said, my boss hasn't told me yet what grave I'm digging. So Jimmy Breslin kind of hung around and then eventually came out. This was the fella who was digging the grave. So he interviewed the grave digger and the grave digger just had I'm not saying a basic story, But like the story starts, he woke up that morning, he spoke to his wife, he had a cup of coffee, he had a bit of toast, and he went to work not knowing what was going to be ahead of him. Like he hadn't a clue. And it just delves into the like he was the closest to every single one of the people in terms of who the press wanted to get and get an interview with. But yet he was able to do his job, I guess, with dignity, respect, privacy, for the family, because as he said at the end of the day, they are a family grieving. And for me, I just think the whole idea of not going to a winning dressing room all the time is something that I quite like. Because I think it's a story that's told over and over and over again. The quote, history is only told by the winners. I very much would agree. And I think sometimes a losing dressing room, which, in Jimmy Breslin and the Gravediggers case, the losing dressing room wasn't a loser necessarily. It was just someone who the press weren't paying attention to. And I always thought that's where kind of the good stories kind of come out and kind of come out of nowhere. So it's probably something just that I related to. I would have tried to have done it, in my career, working with the Irish Times. I would have tried to have not gone where others would have gone. I think one of my last interviews that I did for the Irish Times was with Chris Singleton. He was a former baseball player. He left baseball after his mother was killed in a racially motivated attack in a church in America. And he spoke about the power of forgiveness. And that's what I was trying to do all the time with the articles. I was trying to use sport as the vessel for whatever background story was going on. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
So
Yep.
whether it was kind of women's rights, whether it was peace and forgiveness, whether it was overcoming an obstacle, whatever it may be, I always thought sport was the vessel to share those stories. And the thing about sport is that when you ask people, and same with books and, same with art and a lot of other things, it knocks the guard off people. Because if you go in straight away, tell me your story, what's wrong with you? Instead you could be like, oh, tell me about baseball. I think it's an interesting kind of, way of kind of disarming people, I think, more than anything. And it's fun.
You're pursuing law now, and you're going to be a solicitor. Is that right? And if that's the case, I'm just curious, because you're such a great talker and advocate, I would have thought you'd be a stronger barrister than a solicitor. I could see you in court talking to the judge on behalf of a defendant or whoever it might be, or the whoever it might be. I just had you as that. Is there a reason you're not doing one and doing the other?
The solicitor route, I got my training contract early on. So that helped. So basically, if you get a training contract, you're not stuck with a firm, but you're with the firm for the length of your contract. And that was solicitor only. I have done work experience in courts. I really enjoyed it, getting to meet people. The most embarrassing was people coming up to you saying, oh my God, you inspired me. And then you look at their case file and you're like, oh, not very well did I inspire them. That was one thing where I was like, oh, okay, that's not what I intended to do.
I stole it all for you, Joanne.
Yeah, ideally, don't do that. And, I was working with a couple of solicitors and they were kind of laughing at me. They were like, you've no interest in people's BS. And I was like, I actually don't have no time for it. I was up at 7 this morning, to get into court, to do whatever. So they were all kind of laughing at me because people would start with their story, like, well, let me tell you now, I had a bad day. And I'm like, I don't care about your bad day. Just tell me what you did, why you did it. Please, spare me the details. So they were always laughing at that kind of no nonsense approval. I worked with Frank Butterworth for 6 weeks. So it was
Famous
really,
lawyer,
really interesting. And famous, Frank Butterworth. So it was really fun. It was really interesting. And I think the insights I learned from him in terms of how to deal with people, especially people who are in maybe volatile or emotional situations. And the one thing that he always said to me, and it kind of sticks in my mind, is you have to protect yourself because you're dealing with a lot of people's problems. And you could take those problems on board and then you could get weighed down by those problems. So he was saying it's very important to take care of yourself behind it all. So solicitor, I suppose you're a bit more protected in the corporate world because that's where I am, is in the corporate world. But what they find mostly amusing is if there's a will that comes in, because I'm really nosy, that's journalism.
Yes.
I'm like, oh, give me the will.
Yeah. Well, as we all know, where there's a will, there's a row. But let's go to your final piece of questioning for us here today, Joanne. Is about the autobiography you have yet to write. I mean, you've got one hell of a story, and you're an extraordinary storyteller. So, where are you going for this title? What are you calling it?
Yeah, what I learned when I asked a bunch of my friends would they kind of help out with this kind of situation is I suppose first of all, I do have a list of kind of essays. So I do essays kind of all the time, that I kind of have in the bag. waiting to kind of go. So I mean, some of them were a bit ridiculous that they came up with. So the best one I think that we got was, because I'm a big time procrastinator, was insert title here: a procrastinator's story of how she almost did it all.
I like it.
Yeah, so that was kind of the thing. I don't think I'm interesting enough, to have a book. Like, don't get me wrong. I have the essays as a collection because I don't know about you, but I like to write feelings down, like more than anything. So, like, however I'm feeling in the moment, or something that would kind of pop into my head or anything like that. One of my PAs, God bless them, I've said to them, when Joanne pops her clogs, that's the day they can run to a publisher my iCloud details, and then some poor person has to make sense of all my thoughts.
You are, yeah, just one of life's delightful people. I'm so happy to know you. And there's a book, at least. I think there's probably a few volumes in you. Joanne, I've loved talking to you about your books choices on the bookshelf today, and you just make me very happy whenever we speak. I look forward to seeing you in real life very, very soon, and thanks for your time.
No worries, Ryan, and thanks so much for everything. And good to see you happy and kind of smiling again, because it was no one enjoyed all our times more than us hanging out together. So I'm happy that the two of us have reunited.
For sure. So here's this week's Ryan Recommends, brought to you by Eason, Ireland's favourite bookseller. I'm going to go with Heart Be at Peace, the latest book by Joanne O'Riordan, one of my all-time favourite Irish authors. This is a slim book, and I say that because if you're not a big reader and you just want to kind of get an entry, a gateway drug into bigger, better books, start with this one. He has written a host of books, starting with The Spinning Heart, so you can go all the way back if you want to. But this book is a kind of a sister or brother of the first one, The Spinning Heart. And if you remember a show called Pure Mule, you'll get a sense of what it is. It's the middle of Ireland in the 21st century. It's dark, it's dirty, it's difficult, but it's beautifully written, and all these characters are so well studied. It's short, it's compelling, and it is otherworldly, is what I'll say. This guy writes, it's like you've eaten the most beautiful meal. Joanne O'Riordan, Heart Be at Peace. You will not be disappointed. I'd nearly tell you I'll give you the money back if you don't like it, but go for it. This book and all the books we discuss on this episode of our podcast are available now in your local Eason store, or order them online from easons.com before 6 p.m. for same-day dispatch with free delivery when you spend over a tenner. Eason, be inspired.